Hey guys, tonight we begin with something quietly grim but oddly fascinating. So go ahead, dim the lights, grab your tea, and settle in, because we're floating back to the mid-14th century when the Black Death rolled through Europe like the worst dinner guest in history, showing up uninvited, wrecking everything, and leaving everyone wondering not just who was going to survive, but also, in the meantime, what on earth they were supposed to eat. Now, picture this. Before the plague even arrived, peasants were already living on the edge, their diets mostly a steady, gray parade of barley bread, rye loaves, and oat cakes so dense they probably doubled as excellent doorstops. While pottage, that eternal medieval favorite, bubbled in every smoky hut, a gloopy one-pot wonder of grains, beans, cabbage, or onions, or basically whatever hadn't rotted yet. Sometimes seasoned with a heroic sprig of parsley if the garden hadn't died. And on good days, there might be a sliver of bacon or a salted herring tossed in for excitement, though excitement in this context meant you could vaguely taste something besides turnips. Meanwhile, the upper crust, the lords and ladies in their drafty stone manners, carried on with a quieter version of their usual feasts, serving roasted swan or peacock on silver platters while pretending the servants coughing in the hallways weren't a bad omen. But even they got nervous, because medieval medicine loved blaming diseases on food. So suddenly, all the physicians were wagging fingers at pears, melons, or overly wet vegetables, claiming they opened the body to plague air, while roasted meats, spiced wine, and nicely aged grains were praised as health-preserving delicacies. So, of course, nobles doubled down on cloves, cinnamon, saffron, and whatever else made their kitchen smell like a medieval candle shop, hoping expensive seasonings could frighten death itself. At the same time, ordinary townsfolk scavenged whatever they could find when markets emptied: abandoned grain sacks, onions from deserted gardens, half-fermented ale barrels, because when whole neighborhoods fled or died, someone had to eat the leftovers. And rural villagers foraged hedgerows for nettles, wild garlic, and chestnuts, anything remotely chewable to stretch the family pot. While monasteries, calmer than most places, kept their gardens of leeks, herbs, and cabbages going, brewing faintly medicinal broths that probably cured nothing except hunger. Preservation methods became survival itself, salting, smoking, drying, because fresh food spoiled fast when trade routes collapsed, so pantries filled with hard cheese, dried peas, smoked fish, and ale that was safer than whatever the well water was offering. And fasting, oddly enough, grew popular too, since empty stomachs were thought to leave fewer places for plague vapors to lurk. So people skipped meals half out of fear, half out of necessity, creating the strange rhythm of hoarding food, then avoiding it, then praying over it before finally eating it. Bread trenchers, the big stale bread plates that soaked up stew before being eaten, remained standard, because why waste wood on dishes when you could kill two birds with one stone? And though the quality of grain sometimes improved after the first plague wave, since fewer mouths meant better harvest shares, the taste probably still hovered somewhere between earthy and chewing on sorrow. And as the decades rolled by, with each new outbreak, these eating habits stuck stubbornly around. Cautious use of fruit, obsession with spices, fear of raw anything, endless pots of beans and cabbage, gallons of weak ale, honey for sweetness when it was available, vinegar when it wasn't, and roasted meat only when livestock hadn't dropped dead from whatever mysterious cow disease was circulating that year. So, in many ways, the Black Death didn't just thin the population, it stamped a kind of permanent anxiety onto medieval dining, turning every meal into a tiny medical debate where the doctor said lettuce was safe, pears were not, eels were healthy, but fish caught in the wrong season might kill you twice as fast. And through it all, the surviving nobility clung to their spiced wines and almond milk sauces, while peasants kept ladling out barley stew, everyone united only by the hope that dinner wouldn't be their undoing. So tonight, as we drift through these plague-haunted kitchens and famine-scarred fields, let yourself sink into the strange, gray world of medieval eating, where bread was medicine, spices were amulets, and every bite carried a whisper of fear. Because this is just the beginning of our long, drowsy wander through what people actually ate when the Black Death came calling. So close your eyes, breathe slow, and stay with me as we keep floating deeper into the past, one bland, anxious, medieval mouthful at a time.
As the plague settled into its grim routine of reappearing every few years, like that one cousin who never calls ahead, food culture across Europe didn't so much collapse as wobble dramatically between desperation and superstition. So picture a marketplace in, say, 1350. Half the stalls are empty, the baker is gone because his family fled, and the fishmonger is selling something that might technically be herring, but looks like it lost the will to live several weeks ago. Yet people still show up, clutching coins or barter goods, hoping to find anything that won't kill them faster than the plague itself. Because medieval dietary theory, based on Galen and centuries of cheerful guesswork, insisted certain foods opened the pores to bad air, while others fortified the humors, and the problem was no one entirely agreed on which foods did which. So one doctor would warn against cucumbers, while another claimed they prevented infection. And somewhere in Italy a monk swore vinegar was the secret to eternal life. So peasants just shrugged and kept eating cabbage because cabbage was everywhere, grew fast, and didn't argue back. Meanwhile, nobles leaned harder than ever into spices, not just because they loved showing off their wealth by dumping cinnamon on everything, but because physicians promised spices warmed the stomach and burned off dangerous vapors. So medieval kitchens reeked of cloves, ginger, nutmeg, pepper, and any other dried fragment hauled across the Silk Road by merchants, praying they didn't catch the plague en route. And all this spicy enthusiasm collided beautifully with the medieval love of wine, because nothing said, "This won't kill me," like soaking your food in alcohol first. Whether it was poached pears for dessert, assuming pears were in the safe column that year, or big hunks of meat simmered in wine and spices until even the most nervous physician admitted it smelled medicinal. Down at the peasant level, though, meat was rare enough to count as a holiday miracle, so most people stuck to pottage, that eternal stew of grains, beans, and whatever vegetables hadn't been banned by the local health authorities, eaten with dark bread so coarse it came with free dental wear and tear, washed down with ale so weak it barely counted as alcohol, but at least didn't kill you like the local water supply might. And because famine often followed plague, fields untended, labor gone, livestock wandering off, people filled the gaps with chestnuts, acorns, turnip greens, wild berries, and anything remotely edible, grinding acorns into flour after endless soaking to remove the bitterness, because when the choice was acorn bread or no bread, you learned to love acorns. Monasteries kept their gardens going, producing herbs like sage, rosemary, and thyme, which ended up in both food and the medieval version of medicine cabinets, since a good herbal broth could be spun as both dinner and cure. And fasting, originally a religious thing, took on this weird double life as public health advice, with bishops and doctors agreeing that maybe God and digestion both approved of eating less during plague season. So people dutifully skipped meals on Wednesdays, Fridays, Lent, Advent, or whenever someone announced another fast day, which meant half the calendar involved staring mournfully at yet another bowl of thin cabbage soup. Over time, urban areas developed regulations about food quality, laws against selling bad meat, rotten fish, watered-down ale, not because anyone understood germs yet, but because plague made people very cranky about being poisoned accidentally when death was already everywhere. So cities like London and Paris issued rules about baking proper-sized loaves or not throwing animal guts into the street, though whether anyone obeyed is another story entirely. Meanwhile, medical recipe books kept circulating, cheerfully suggesting things like boil your meat with sage and vinegar to resist pestilence, or avoid milk in summer because it spoils the humors, while the truly fancy households ordered sugar, still a luxury, and made candied fruits, spiced syrups, and almond milk custards as though dessert alone might chase away the Black Death. And to be fair, if you were going to die horribly, you might as well have pudding first. Yet despite all this dietary advice, the plague rolled on, ignoring whether you ate barley gruel or swan and ginger sauce. So after each wave, people returned nervously to their routines, planting rye and barley again, salting fish again, brewing ale again, filling their larders with smoked pork or dried beans, always with one eye on the horizon in case the next rumor of plague meant it was time to flee, fast, or buy more cinnamon. And through it all, medieval Europe developed this almost superstitious attachment to certain safe foods: roasted meats, baked bread, spiced wine, bitter herbs, while raw fruit, fresh milk, or anything cold and moist lived under suspicion for centuries, shaping diets long after the plague itself faded. Because once fear settles into a culture's cooking habits, it tends to stick like porridge at the bottom of a pot. So by the end of the 14th century, European cuisine was basically a map of everything people thought might stop them from dropping dead, even if most of it didn't work. And tonight, as we drift through those anxious kitchens and half-empty markets, we can almost hear the muttering physicians, the sizzling roasts, the clatter of bread trenchers, the prayers over boiling cabbage pots, everyone eating cautiously, nervously, superstitiously, as though the right dinner might hold back the dark a little longer. So stay with me, keep that tea warm, and let's keep wandering through this uneasy medieval menu together, slowly, calmly, one spiced bite at a time.
As the 14th century limped along under the shadow of the plague, food habits didn't just survive. They got weirdly ceremonial, like the entire continent decided eating had to be both practical and vaguely magical at the same time. So while peasants still clung to their eternal pottage, this bubbling cauldron of grains, peas, cabbage, onions, maybe a lucky carrot or two, the upper classes doubled down on elaborate banquets because nothing says we're definitely not panicking like hosting a 12-course dinner while half the town dies outside. So picture some French duke in velvet robes insisting on swan roasted with ginger and almond sauce because obviously the plague couldn't touch you if the bird was fancy enough. And doctors kept showing up at these feasts muttering about the four humors, declaring that roasted meats were hot and dry, vegetables cold and moist, and wine, conveniently, was always medicinal, which explains why medieval people treated wine like we treat bottled water, dumping it into stews, sauces, marinades, or just drinking it straight from the jug because clearly hydration required at least 10% alcohol. But behind all this theatrical eating lay the constant fear that food itself might spread disease. So cities started cracking down on market vendors, with London banning the sale of meat after 4 days in summer or 8 in winter. Not that anyone owned a thermometer, they just guessed the temperature by whether their breath fogged. And officials wandered around sniffing fish stalls like medieval health inspectors, fining butchers for selling dodgy pork, while bakers got yelled at for shrinking loaves to save grain because bread was life, literally, with every medieval diet built around it. Peasants ate coarse rye or barley loaves dense enough to double as doorstops, while the rich demanded fine white wheat bread called manchet, a word that basically meant, I can afford bread without rocks in it. Yet plague years brought famine so often that even nobles ended up gnawing the dark stuff sometimes, which must have felt spiritually humiliating, like trading your Mercedes for a bicycle. And famine drove people to extremes, gathering wild herbs, scraping bark for flour substitutes, or boiling nettles for soup because hunger didn't care about social class. Though the rich still had spices, sugar, and wine to dress up their desperation, while peasants got whatever the fields grudgingly offered. Monasteries tried to keep some agricultural stability, tending orchards and herb gardens, raising bees for honey, preserving fruit in barrels of syrup or vinegar because preservation became obsession.
salting, smoking, drying, pickling everything from fish to cabbage. Since plague or not, winter always came. And when trade routes faltered, people rediscovered local foods out of sheer necessity. So Northern Europe leaned on herring, rye, and turnips. The Mediterranean clung to olives, figs, and chestnuts, while inland villages lived on whatever grew within walking distance, usually ending up with lots of beans because beans didn't die easily and sort of pretended to be meat if you squinted, which explains why chroniclers keep mentioning bean stews like they were the soundtrack of medieval survival. Meanwhile, medical recipe books cheerfully promise plague protection through diet, suggesting things like roasted onions, radish salads, or spiced pomegranate wine, always spiced, because medieval people truly believed cinnamon could cure death itself, so merchants made fortunes shipping little sacks of cloves and nutmeg from Asia, while entire towns starved 2 valleys over. And fasting rules kept colliding with reality here too, since the church demanded meatless Fridays and endless Lent restrictions. But plague doctors warned against fish in certain seasons because melancholic vapors apparently hid in trout. So people just shrugged and ate whatever the least terrifying authority recommended that week, leading to weird compromises like almond milk cheese or pea and onion pies, pretending to be proper meals because medieval cuisine loved disguises. Fake fish made of rice paste, fake meat molded from beans, colored jelly shaped like castles. Because if you couldn't eat well, you might as well eat theatrically, right? Yet underneath the pageantry, famine kept circling back, especially after plague waves cut labor forces so badly that fields lay empty, mills stopped grinding, bakeries closed, and even nobles sometimes fled to the countryside, hoping to find grain that hadn't already been looted by hungry neighbors. So chroniclers describe entire villages reduced to gathering roots, acorns, weeds, anything vaguely chewable, boiling grass into bread that probably tasted like despair itself. And while city councils tried organizing grain imports or price controls, hoarding and black markets thrived, with rich merchants buying up wheat to resell later at obscene prices, because nothing says human nature like profiteering during a pandemic. Yet through all this chaos, food traditions adapted in slow, stubborn ways. People learned to dry apples into leathery sheets for winter, pickle cabbage into sauerkraut, smoke eels over low fires, brew stronger ales that lasted longer in barrels. And gradually these survival tricks shaped regional cuisines for centuries. So German towns clung to sauerkraut, English villages to oatcakes, Italians to chestnut flour breads, each habit born from plague-era panic, but surviving because it worked. And meanwhile, the medical world kept insisting on dietary balance, handing out endless advice like avoid cold fruits unless stewed, eat roasted meats with bitter herbs, or my favorite, drink wine against corrupted air, as though plague germs paused politely at the sight of mulled claret. And by the late 1300s, people half believed it, shaping entire meal plans around what doctors claimed pleased the humors. So medieval cookbooks read like half medicine, half dinner party guide, recommending fennel for digestion, sage for long life, vinegar for cleansing, and rose water because apparently smelling nice also cured things. Though in practice, most peasants just kept eating barley porridge, cabbage soup, black bread, beans, and the occasional turnip because, plague or no plague, theory cost money, and beans didn't. So by the time we drift out of this century of fear and fumbling advice, Europe's diet has become this odd mix of superstition, scarcity, and stubborn tradition. A world where people salt fish like treasure, stir honey into medicinal tonics, stew onions for health, pray over their cabbages, and spit spiced wine at funerals, convinced that somewhere in the balance of hot, cold, wet, and dry foods lay the secret to surviving both famine and death itself, even though half of them clearly didn't, but the recipes endured, carrying medieval anxieties quietly forward every time someone salted a herring or boiled a pot of beans, long after the plague carts stopped rolling through the streets.
As plague years kept rolling on like some cosmic joke that Europe never found funny, food culture shifted from whatever they could grab survival mode into this oddly structured blend of old superstition, fragile trade networks, and the occasional noble family pretending everything was perfectly fine with another banquet.
So picture this. Peasants scraping by on the same gray porridge, while some French count hosts a feast with peacock served in its own feathers, because apparently the birds weren't just dinner, but medieval Instagram content. Yet underneath all the roasted swans and sugar sculptures sat a growing unease about what food did to the body, because medieval people treated digestion like modern people treat Wi-Fi signals, constantly worried it wasn't balanced properly. So medical texts kept warning against cold foods like cucumbers unless you drowned them in vinegar, while hot foods like mustard were considered useful unless you overdid it and overheated your liver, which supposedly led straight to plague death, because of course it did. So cities posted official diet advice like we post weather alerts, telling people to avoid fruit in late summer or to eat more sour things in autumn. And meanwhile, famine kept ignoring everyone's pamphlets and showing up anyway, especially when plague-driven labor shortages left wheat rotting in fields or mills standing silent because everyone who knew how to run them was dead. So bread prices soared, peasants rioted, and governments responded with their usual genius solution of fining bakers for selling small loaves as though bread quantity laws could magically summon more grain. But food preservation became the real obsession of the century because nobody trusted tomorrow anymore. So salting, smoking, and pickling weren't just cooking methods. They were survival strategies, leading to entire industries built around salt mining, herring fisheries, wine storage, and grain warehouses, with towns passing laws about barrel sizes and salt purity like their lives depended on it, which honestly they did. While monasteries quietly became Europe's food tech innovators, experimenting with fish ponds, apple orchards, and herb gardens because monks had both the time and the literacy to write things down. So half of what we know about medieval diet comes from some bored monk noting exactly how many carp Brother Thomas caught in 1352. And through these records, we see the slow rise of regional food identities, like Italian villages leaning into chestnuts, turning them into flour for bread and cakes, or German towns perfecting sauerkraut not because they loved cabbage that much, but because it didn't die in winter storage like everything else, while Northern Europe clung to herring so fiercely that entire economies revolved around drying, salting, and shipping the things by the barrel, especially since the church kept demanding meatless days and Lent fasting, which might have been spiritually uplifting, but mostly turned half the continent into reluctant pescatarians 9 weeks a year. So fish wasn't just food, it was religious compliance, trade currency, and alleged plague prevention all at once. Meanwhile, spices kept arriving from the east in tiny, ridiculously expensive sacks because medieval people believed cinnamon cured everything from bad digestion to bad air. So nobles dumped it on everything like modern people using sriracha, while the poor made do with mustard seeds or wild garlic because at least those grew nearby. But the gap between rich and poor diets kept widening in plague times, not narrowing, since the wealthy hoarded grain, bought up livestock, and could afford preserved delicacies like dried figs or candied almonds, while peasants got acorns, weeds, and whatever root vegetables hadn't been stolen by equally desperate neighbors, leading to food riots where angry townspeople broke into warehouses accusing merchants of hiding grain to drive up prices. Which, to be fair, the merchants absolutely were, because nothing says human solidarity like profiting off mass starvation. And yet through all this chaos, medieval cookbooks started appearing, not just for nobles, but for rising middle-class households, stuffed with recipes that mixed genuine culinary creativity with pure medical nonsense, suggesting things like stew pears with wine and cloves to strengthen the heart, or boil lettuce to calm excessive passions, because apparently salad therapy was a thing. Though most peasants reading, or more likely hearing, these recipes probably just stirred another pot of barley gruel and called it a day, since plague or no plague, nobody was getting cloves in bulk outside the 1%. And speaking of bulk, cities tried coping with famine by importing grain from anywhere still standing, leading to these early international trade webs where Venetian ships hauled wheat from the Black Sea, Hanseatic merchants moved herring from the Baltic, and Flemish towns shipped salt everywhere, all while plague kept killing dock workers, sailors, millers, and bakers. So shortages bounced around like medieval dominoes, One bad harvest in Poland meant bread riots in Paris 3 months later. Yet despite all this instability, food rituals didn't vanish, they just adapted. So nobles kept hosting feasts even if the courses shrank. Monasteries kept fasting even if the fish was half rotten. And doctors kept handing out plague diet rules like avoid wind-producing vegetables because beans were apparently suspicious, though everyone ate them anyway since protein is protein. And by the late 1300s, you start seeing these strange contradictions where people believed food carried disease, yet also believed the right food cured it. So they avoided raw fruit fearing corrupted air, but guzzled spiced wine claiming it cleansed the humors, creating this whole culture of medicinal dining where every meal doubled as health care. And honestly, part of me thinks that's why so many weird recipes survived, because even if they didn't stop the plague, people clung to the idea that cinnamon pears or almond milk soups gave them some control over a collapsing world. And so medieval Europe stumbled toward the 15th century with diets permanently changed by plague, famine, trade shifts, and medical theories, carrying forward not just sauerkraut and herring, but the deeper belief that what you ate decided whether you lived, died, or at least felt slightly less doomed while the bells tolled outside.
By the time Europe stumbled deeper into the late 1300s, after decades of plague waves marching through like they had season tickets, the whole relationship between people and food had grown increasingly neurotic. So imagine towns where every bell toll reminded you that your neighbor had died yesterday and the baker shut down today because no one left could run the ovens. And yet the noble household down the road was still roasting a peacock, sticking its own feathers back on, and parading it through the hall like some kind of medieval reality TV stunt. Because nobles lived in their own world where food had to look dramatic even when half the countryside was on barley mush. And medical writers, bless their confused hearts, kept telling people that plague prevention basically boiled down to don't eat the wrong thing, as though death would politely skip over anyone who balanced their humors correctly. So we get these treatises recommending everything from roasted almonds with sugar for strengthening the body to avoiding eels because they were cold and moist, and apparently too much moisture inside you made plague more interested in setting up camp. Which makes no sense, but medieval people doubled down anyway. And city councils even posted dietary guidelines like it was a medieval version of the food pyramid, except instead of eat more vegetables, it was drink light wines, avoid melancholy meats, and try not to inhale air near cabbages. Because for reasons lost to time, cabbages had a terrible reputation for filling the body with bad vapors. Though honestly, given medieval sanitation, almost everything filled the air with bad vapors. But despite the constant fear, trade kept reshaping diets because cities still wanted grain, armies still needed rations, monasteries still demanded fish for fasting days, and rich merchants wanted spices on literally everything. So caravans brought pepper, ginger, and cinnamon across plague-riddled trade routes where half the muleteers might die on the way, yet the spices still arrived, cost more than rent, and ended up dumped into wine, meat sauces, and desserts, because medieval elites had one consistent rule: if it's expensive, pour it on everything. And this is also why sugar, which came in awkward rock-hard cones you had to saw pieces off, was treated like medicine and status symbol rolled into one, leading to desserts shaped like tassels and animals, while peasants maybe saw sugar once a year if they worked in a lord's kitchen and licked the spoons, but otherwise made do with honey, unless bees died off in bad years, which sometimes happened because plague didn't just hit humans. It disrupted farming cycles, meaning fewer flowers, fewer bees, and goodbye honey cakes. So substitute sweeteners like boiled-down fruit syrups appeared, proving that even in crisis, humanity refuses to live without dessert. Though for most rural households, the menu stayed painfully predictable. Rye bread, barley porridge, turnips, leeks, maybe some dried beans if nobody stole them, and on rare feast days a bit of pork fat or cheese. While townsfolk got slightly more variety. Herring barrels, cheap wine, maybe almonds from trade ships if they were lucky, but everything depended on whether plague, weather, or war cut off supplies, which happened constantly, so cities created early food regulations trying to stabilize chaos, passing laws about bread weights, banning grain exports during shortages, inspecting wine barrels for fraud because medieval merchants watered down everything. Yet famine still arrived whenever harvests failed or too many laborers were dead to gather crops, leading to these grim cycles where one year people blamed God for punishment, next year they blamed corrupt bakers, then back to God again. while doctors kept printing plague cookbooks like the Regiment of Health, insisting that roasted meats, moderate wine, and plenty of vinegar might keep you alive, though given survival rates, I wouldn't call it a winning strategy. But what's fascinating is how religious food rules adapted without collapsing entirely. So the church kept enforcing fasting seasons even when plague made everyone malnourished, meaning people substituted fish, eggs, or almond milk for meat, leading to this explosion of medieval vegetarian-ish recipes not out of ethics but obligation. And almond milk in particular became the oat milk of the 14th century, poured into soups, sauces, even fake butter, because it stored well, didn't spoil like dairy, and monks could eat it without breaking fasting rules. So trade in almonds boomed despite plagues wrecking ports and caravans, proving yet again that human beings will do anything for creamy soup texture. And meanwhile, wine consumption soared, since people half believed it purified the body, half just needed a drink while burying relatives. So vineyards expanded across France, Spain, Italy, and Germany, churning out everything from fancy spiced wines for nobles to terrifying sour vintages for peasants, while beer culture spread in Northern Europe where grapes refused to grow, meaning towns like Hamburg and Bruges ran entire economies on ale production because clean water wasn't really a thing. So yes, half the population was buzzed most of the time, partly because weak ale was safer than wells full of mystery diseases, but also because medieval life during plague years was emotionally exhausting, so people clung to food rituals, feast days, fasting days, harvest festivals, even as death carts rolled by, because eating together made the world feel briefly normal. And cookbooks from the era show this weird mix of desperation and stubborn luxury. Recipes for meat pies next to instructions on preserving rose petals in honey for winter medicine. So by the end of the century, European diets had quietly transformed. Fewer grain-only meals when trade allowed, more preserved fish, more legumes, more use of acidic flavors like vinegar and verjuice, because people thought sourness cut plague vapors. And above all, a growing belief that what you ate shaped health, morality, even fate itself. So households planted herb gardens for plague prevention, apothecaries sold cinnamon at ridiculous markups, doctors kept preaching moderation like medieval lifestyle coaches. And yet famine still arrived, plague still returned, peasants still rioted, nobles still feasted, and through it all, the medieval dinner table became this strange stage where fear, faith, science, and sheer human stubbornness all sat down together, pretending someone had control over a world clearly run by rats and fleas with zero respect for medical diet plans.
As the 14th century dragged on with its usual combination of plagues, famines, random wars, and kings arguing over who owned what cow pasture, medieval people developed this odd determination to keep eating like life was normal, even when it wasn't. So towns kept running markets, bakers kept firing ovens, brewers kept making ale, even when half the guild members had either died or fled, because nobody wanted to give up bread or beer just because the apocalypse was casually strolling by. And city councils got increasingly cranky about food supply, issuing laws on everything from bread size to fish prices, sometimes threatening bakers with public humiliation if loaves came out too small, because apparently nothing says civic order like forcing someone to carry bad bread through the streets on their head. Yet behind all this official regulation, there was the constant medieval belief that the plague wasn't random at all, but somehow connected to what you ate, how you behaved, or which bodily humors were running the show inside you. So doctors and clergy kept giving out diet advice, like medieval lifestyle influencers, warning people to avoid wet foods in spring, dry foods in summer, sour things when you were melancholy, sweet things when angry, and absolutely no garlic if the air felt heavy, whatever that meant. Though peasants ignored most of this because if you only had rye, cabbage, and maybe a turnip, you ate rye, cabbage, and turnip whether or not the stars thought it was a good idea. While nobles, being nobles, embraced dietary astrology like it was their personal Netflix series, timing feasts to zodiac signs, hiring doctors to lecture on whether pepper was making Mars angry, and paying ridiculous sums for spices from plague-ravaged trade routes because cinnamon supposedly warmed the blood, which sounded healthy enough to excuse dumping it into everything from wine to eel pies. Yes, eel pies, because medieval people loved eels with baffling enthusiasm, stuffing them into pastries, boiling them in almond milk, roasting them whole, while medical texts frowned and muttered about moist fish corrupting the humors. So of course nobles doubled down and ate more, because nothing makes medieval elites commit harder than being told not to.
And meanwhile, monasteries, those great engines of fasting days and fish demand, kept shaping diets by banning meat half the year, pushing people toward fish, beans, vegetables, and especially weird meat substitutes like ground almonds or peas mashed into fake cheese, meaning half the era's accidental vegetarian cuisine came from monks trying to follow rules even as plague emptied half their refectories. Yet feast culture never really died either, because surviving nobles insisted on hosting lavish banquets mid-pandemic, roasting swans, shaping jellies into castles, dyeing sauces bright green or blood red just to show off expensive spices. So you'd have these surreal scenes where peasants starved outside city walls, while inside nobles paraded stuffed peacocks redressed in their own feathers, as though daring the Black Death to notice their table manners. And at the same time, medical texts like the Taquinum Sanitatis illustrated ideal diets full of lettuce, apples, herbs, light meats, and wine, gently suggesting moderation while actual people ignored half the advice, especially the part about moderation. So instead, you got fasting extremes on one end, binge feasting on the other, with peasants occasionally rioting when grain shortages hit because too many laborers were dead to bring in harvests, leading to price spikes, hoarding, and councils ordering grain seizures to keep bread ovens running, since bread wasn't just food, but public order itself. And in some regions, especially Italy and France, cities even built municipal granaries as early crisis management, a kind of medieval food security system born out of sheer plague-era panic. While across northern Europe, the beer industry quietly exploded because barley grew reliably and nobody trusted water anymore. So ale became breakfast, lunch, dinner, and plague tonic all in one, sometimes weak and cheap for peasants, sometimes strong and spiced for elites, but always safer than wells that occasionally doubled as disease distribution systems. And wine kept flowing too, vineyards in France and Spain recovering faster than populations, because apparently grapes didn't care how many villagers died as long as someone harvested them. So wine became medicine, hydration, and coping mechanism rolled into one, with doctors prescribing it like liquid hand sanitizer, adding herbs, spices, even gold flakes if you had money and very little common sense, while poorer households flavored theirs with whatever grew locally, parsley, lavender, violets, creating this whole side industry of healthy wines meant to balance humors, though whether they balanced anything besides people's ability to stand upright is questionable. And through all this, the medieval diet slowly diversified, not because anyone planned it, but because crisis kept forcing change. Labor shortages made meat slightly more available to peasants, since fewer lords ran huge hunting estates. Trade disruptions pushed people toward local crops. Famine years encouraged preserving foods by salting, pickling, smoking, drying. So by 1400, European pantries looked different than in 1300. More beans, more cabbage, more preserved fish, more experimental cooking with vinegar and sour grapes, because people decided acidity scared plague vapors away. And while none of this saved lives in any measurable way, it did reshape cuisine, setting the stage for Renaissance cooking with its love of sugar, spices, and decorative food that looked like architecture. Though peasants mostly kept eating pottage, that eternal stew of grain, vegetables, maybe a bone if you had one, boiled all day in the hearth, so thick it could probably patch roof leaks. And honestly, given survival rates, pottage did as much for health as all the medical diet books combined, which didn't stop those books from multiplying, filled with zodiac charts, humor diagrams, saints' feast calendars, all insisting food could control fate if you stirred the pot correctly. Yet plague kept returning, dinner kept getting served, and medieval Europe carried on convinced that somewhere between the cabbage bans, almond milk experiments, vinegar wines, eel pies, bread riots, and peacock parades, someone would finally get the recipe for survival right, though history suggests the rats remained unimpressed.